To celebrate the rising sales of its drug Crestor, AstraZeneca has funded the wining and dining of 600 Filipino doctors. For those trying to produce evidence-based guidelines, the conflicts of interest found here are a disturbing distraction.
Conflicts of interest when you make clinical practice guidelines is a big problem, I think, in any developing country, because the influence of pharmaceutical companies on clinical practice is much greater or far greater than what you see in developed countries.
From the lavish dinners to the luxury of being driven round town by a beautiful young drug rep. From the selling in surgeries to the seduction in hospital corridors, drug company influence in the Philippines is a national scandal.
They are not restricted at all in countries like ours, so they're free to promote and do favors for physicians in pursuit of more sales.
Tony Dans is a long-time member of the International Network of Clinical Epidemiology, or INCLEN, which has been heavily funded in the past by the Rockefeller Foundation. It was INCLEN which inspired the methodology behind a new clinical guideline designed to give doctors independent information that counters drug company influence.
Here, what we did is that in the methodology we included addressing conflict of interest before the initiation of the guideline development.
What we can avoid here actually is the direct conflict of interest. And when I say direct conflict of interest, this will come in the form of the one sitting in the panel doing the clinical practice guideline is also employed as, let us say, a medical director in the pharmaceutical company, or someone who is commissioned to do research, or even hired to promote the products. That, I think, is a clear direct conflict of interest.
Sometimes visited by 3 young drug reps at the same time, Eugene Reyes also chairs the technical committee that initiated the new lipid-lowering guideline. Again inspired by INCLEN, his committee declined drug company sponsorship and then reviewed the conflicts of interest of all panel members, a process bringing some embarrassing findings.
I have the highest conflict of interest after we have reviewed everything, after we have defined what conflict of interest is, after we have enumerated all the possible sources of conflict of interest, then after we have labeled everything and put a grade on it, I have the highest level of conflict of interest. And so the only solution there is for me not to partake in the guideline development, but that's not possible. So I tried to control them one by one.
Deciding to slowly undo his multiple ties to industry, guideline developer Eugene Reyes still finds it hard to avoid accepting all favours. Like being chauffeur-driven between different hospital appointments by AstraZeneca's Didi, who will also deliver him to this evening's AstraZeneca dinner, where more food, flattery and friendship awaits.
Well, majority of them are from Metro Manila, so they just came here either on their own, or some of our medical representatives may have brought them here.
Investing heavily in the promotion of expensive new drugs that most poor Filipinos could never afford, the manufacturers still seem determined to try and portray these events as scientific education. Not the wining and dining they clearly are.
I think the wining and dining is a thing of the past, because we do follow guidelines that 66% of our activity should be scientific. So right from the very start, we did show them the studies while they were having cocktails.
Along with conflicts of interest, the developers of the new guideline also address the problem of inequality, considering, for example, whether people on low incomes and at low risk would really benefit from costly new lipid-lowering drugs.
I believe that making guidelines like this, where you consider inequities, at least avoids aggravating the inequities that already exist in society.
Like her partner Tony, Inde Dans is a member of the International Network of Clinical Epidemiology, or INCLEN.
We probably have produced about 100 clinical epidemiologists now, and most of these are clinicians who hold key positions in different societies, universities, training centers all over the country. And since they hold key positions, they're aware of the principles involved in evidence-based medicine, they have tried to incorporate EBM into their, in almost all aspects of their work.
INCLEN is an unsung hero in healthcare in many developing countries. It's responsible for training, in the Philippines for example, for training a critical mass of clinical epidemiologists that are now going around the country teaching evidence-based medicine and trying to promote rational drug use.
INCLEN in this country has basically convinced doctors, and a lot of policymakers, but not necessarily the public, but that evidence-based medicine chooses the proper way to do things, that you could not just depend anymore purely on the individual discretion of clinicians or other healthcare professionals.
Another INCLEN member, Eduardo Banzon, is helping bring an evidence-based approach to the nation's large insurer, PhilHealth.
And a health insurer basically do resource allocation decisions. You decide which particular treatment you should be putting money in, which particular illness you'll be investing against. And so it would be critical that a lot of decisions be based on the evidence rather than the one who shouts most.
Dolores A. Valencerina.
Vested interests may still shout the loudest, but the more independent voices of evidence-based medicine are also being heard here in the Philippines. Today, Tony Dans has received a National Service Award from the President herself.
While I'm not convinced I deserve it as an individual, I'm pleased with the award because it recognizes the importance of the work we're trying to do, which is to try to incorporate evidence in clinical practice and in public health policy.
The tentative steps by guideline writers to reduce the influence of vested interests are taking place against a backdrop of murky financial ties as ubiquitous as they are inappropriate. But the guidelines are nevertheless a glimmer of hope in an otherwise unhealthy environment.